10 and 5. I'm Gavin Hignight, and I have with me tonight Jenn Wexler. Jenn is a filmmaker, director, producer, writer. She's gotten quite known for a film that she wrote and directed called The Ranger, a slasher horror film. Jenn, say hello to everybody and let us know a little bit about The Ranger.
Hi, everybody. So The Ranger is it's a punk rock slasher. It's about a bunch of teen punks that get in trouble with the cops, and they go to the woods to hide out, where they come up against a killer park ranger who starts to take them out one by one.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you is slasher movies. What was your first? Do you remember your first experience seeing a slasher movie?
My first experience fully sitting and watching a slasher movie was when I was 10 years old, and I watched I Know We Did Last Summer at a sleepover party.
Nice.
And everyone else fell asleep. And I mean, I'm a child of the late 90s teen slasher craze. That is what, while I had been a fan of scary stuff earlier than that, when I was a kid, I used to be into like Are You Afraid of the Dark and stuff like that. But when I was 10 years old, that's when those movies started to hit. And it was just like the perfect timing for me to just suck me in. So I remember I was at a sleepover party, everyone else had fallen asleep, and I was just like mesmerized by the movie. And I was just like, this is like, it was like my brain like leveled up. I just reached a whole new world.
And from that, that's interesting to me because The Ranger evokes 80s slasher to me so well. So I wouldn't have expected the 90s answer. So clearly you kept going and you dug deeper, and that kind of started to inform your taste in that genre?
For sure. So then throughout all of my teenage years, the first couple of years, 10 to 13, I don't know, I was obsessed with Scream, I Know It Last Summer, Urban Legend, The Faculty, Disturbing Behavior, I'll go on and on. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And then as I started to really get into my teenage years, I was like, I have to know everything about horror. And that's when I started to like teach myself about the movies that came before it. And it's especially interesting like with Scream, right? Scream obviously has so many references to so many movies. And it was like, looking back at my experience, it's kind of funny to do it the opposite way. I think a lot of people who are older than me did it, where like you watch Scream and you recognize the references. For me, it was like, I watched Scream and then I watched the other movies, and then I started picking up what Scream was doing after the fact.
That's cool. Yeah, that is. It's like a reversal.
Yeah.
Wow. And so that being said, you have this knowledge of horror. When you and I met, you were working in horror and using all that knowledge. Then you went to the East Coast and started producing. Am I right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how you started producing and how that led to The Ranger coming to being.
Well, even before we do that, just
Yeah.
to expand a little bit more on what you said. So Gavin and I worked at FearNet together, and I got an internship at FearNet right out of college. And it was like my first job in the world of entertainment. And that quickly turned into a marketing coordinator job where I worked with Gavin on the marketing team. And, but that really
And you still talk to me after all this time.
Yeah, it's true. That really introduced me to like horror as an industry, and as a business. And so I was there for 4 years, and that really, it just exposed, like it introduced me to so many more movies. And it just like taught me about how things worked. And it was cool seeing different directors like come into the offices and take meetings and everything. And that's where I learned about Glass Eye Pix, Larry Fessenden's company, because it was right around the same time House of the Devil was coming out, and The Innkeepers and Bitter Feast. Like they had all these movies that came out in the mid 2000s. I Saw the Dead, and I was just like, what is this company? And so I started to become a fan of Glass Eye Pix while I was working at FearNet. I moved to the East Coast. They're based in New York City, and I got an introduction to Larry, and he hired me to work for their company. So that's when I moved away from marketing and into production, and I started learning the ropes for how you make movies.
And from where I was sitting, it looked like boot camp. It looked like you were just like, okay, I'm not going into the 6 foot. I'm jumping into the 12 foot, and either I'm going to know how to do this or I'm going to sing.
Yeah.
It looked pretty intense from where I was.
That's how it was. I mean, it was like, I was like, hey, I want to produce and I ultimately want to direct. And I said that in my first meeting with Larry and with Peter Pope, who produced for Glass Eye. And they were like, all right, if you want to do it, let's do it. And then, yeah, I just jumped into it. And it was good because I had a safety net, you know, like, especially, well, I made some short form content with them. I produced Larry's ABCs of Death 2 segment, and I produced some like short segments for Chiller, the TV channel. And then I did that stuff first, and I had the safety net. If I ran into anything, I had experienced producers I could talk to if I needed help with anything. And then when I produced my first feature, which was Most Beautiful Island, while that was like, I was like the lead producer on it, and that was really my like first foray into like, oh wow, this is my set, like I have to like run this thing, you know, my responsibility. I still had them in the background that I could turn to just in case. So.
Yeah. So that being said, did you go to film school? Did you have film school training before?
So I went to school where I focused on screenwriting.
Okay. That makes sense.
And I took some film classes, but really my program was focused on screenwriting. Okay.
So at school, you got the writing, like the on paper of it. And then working with Larry and his team, you got that's where you got the producing chops. So that was kind of because a lot of people, it would be, I went to school, I made the short film in school. That's kind of how I started to learn this stuff. And then, but instead you were producing content with them and had gone into the,
And even while I was at FearNet, towards the end of my time there, I started making shorts with like Drew Daywalt. And those were like super, like, that was really the start of my production training, because that was like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know I want to tell a 3-minute horror tale. And this is, so that was, I directed like 3 really short and sweet horror shorts. And then working at Glass Eye, I started to learn like the real way you do it, where you're paying people. And
right. Stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, horror films, so few people get to cross into the real way you do it, where you're paying people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or getting paid.
Fair. True.
Yeah. So you are of a very small group of people who have learned how to make a living with horror films. That being said, I want to ask, feature film is no joke. That is a challenge. So looking back, what do you think is the biggest challenge of pre-production on the Ranger? What was the biggest challenge of production? And then I'm kind of thinking like post-production and promotion, selling the film. What were the challenges in those stages?
I think, well, pre-production wise, the challenge is always raising the money, especially when it's your first feature. It's really, really hard. I had produced like 5 features before I moved into directing The Ranger. But even so, there's always this little bit of like, well, what have you done? Like, what have you directed? Can we see what you've directed? So I made a teaser. We got into this program called Frontiers, which is at the Fantasia Film Festival, which is like a film market where you pitch your movie to investors. And that's really, after we got into that program and we did our pitch, that's how we got our financing. And then everything started to move. But up until then, I mean, financing for anything is always hard, especially when it's your first film.
Yeah. It's like a chicken and the egg situation.
Totally.
Yeah.
And you just have to, you know, really, you just have to create all these materials. You have to create a lookbook. You obviously have your script, creating a teaser or a reel or whatever. You just want to give the people you're pitching to like the utmost security that you have your vision, you know how to tell the story, you're confident, you know.
Yeah. Because it's horror, do you feel like it was, you had additional hurdles or challenges being a female writer-director? or do you think it was just the general challenge that anyone has?
I think it was the general challenge anyone has. I think it's hard for all people trying to get their first film made, when you don't come from a position of having the financing in your bank account, you know,
Totally.
or having family that can just finance it for you. I think the only part where gender played a role for me specifically is that, you know, not to be too broad about it, but we live in a world where I think when you're a girl growing up, you're, you know, taught that you have to have everything perfect before you like can make that move. Whereas I think a lot of boys grow up with this like sense of audacity. I see.
That's interesting.
Like,
Yeah.
I just know a lot more dudes that come out of film school that are like, I'm ready to make my first feature. Whereas I know I came out of film school, and then I took 4 years working at Fearnet in marketing, and then I made like 5 features as a producer before I was like, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm ready to direct.
I think that's fascinating. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And I think it's somewhat of a sex thing, because I know other women also who deal with that kind of thing too. Like they were just brought up with this thing like we need some kind of permission. And
Right.
Of course, not everybody. Some people don't face that at all.
Totally.
But
I think the insight that you have about policing yourself to be perfect, I think that's what's so interesting to me, is that it's like a culture that it's like you were policing yourself to be bulletproof, basically.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that I have all that experience. Like I know how to make a movie in and out. I know how the business works because I spent 4 years at Fearnet first,
right,
studying all this. Like I know all this stuff. I'm so glad to have that education. But I wish I could go back in time and tell like Jen right out of film school, like, yo, fucking do it.
Yeah,
like,
do it.
Follow your dreams.
Yeah.
You know?
So pre-production, what about during shooting? Shooting an indie feature, never easy.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Okay, good.
Like we had a great time. It was like summer camp. It was because our film, like we treated it like a family atmosphere. We work with people we work with all the time at Glass Eye Picks. You know, my DP was a DP on another movie that I had produced called Like Me. Gaffer, you know, was on that movie and on this movie. So it's kind of like a family that goes from movie to movie together. And this was like, hey, we're going to be in the woods in the spring. Everyone had a great attitude. I mean, it was like really a lovely shoot. I would say just the hardest thing was probably just a physical thing, which is on our very last day, we had to like climb a mountain to get our epic climax sequence. And we had it, it was like so steep. We had to get to this fire tower, and it was so steep that like roads didn't go there. Like, so we couldn't just have a truck. So everyone had to carry their equipment up this like crazy hike. And I felt bad because the actors had to like do this hike. They were super into it, but like, I was like, oh my God, my SAG actors, like I had to tell them that in order to get to set, they have to like climb for 2 hours up into the air.
Yeah,
so
that's scary. Yeah.
Overall though, it was super fun.
Yeah. There's a lot of people who've made these movies, they've had fun making them, but they're not necessarily good movies. And movies have to be good and they have to resonate with people, which yours did. You know, that's magic. Like you can't plan it. Like you can plan a good movie and you can write a good movie and you can hope it's a good movie by the time you get it edited and in front of people. That's a lot of work. Does it still resonate with people? It either does or it doesn't, which The Ranger totally did. It had legs. How was like that, like the festival circuit and selling it, and oh my God, people like this movie. Who's Jenn Wexler?
It was amazing. It was so much fun. Like my dream was to premiere at South by Southwest, and we did, and we were in the midnight section. And I mean, I'd gone to South by like 5 years in a row, a couple years just as a fan. I went with Fearnet a couple years before that, and I remember I was like taking photos for Fearnet of the red carpet, and I was just like looking at all the filmmakers and just around. Yeah, I mean, South by is an amazing festival, and I was just like, oh my God, I would love to have. So anyway, when we got into South by, it was like, yes, like dream festival.
Yeah.
And it was a totally amazing experience. And then after South by, it was really cool. We played a lot of festivals all over the world. I tried to go to as many as possible. I went to like Brazil for the first time.
That's cool.
And Spain and England. In London, we opened Fright Fest.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was a total blast. I loved every moment of it. I'm sad that it's over.
Yeah, well, it's yeah, and now you have to just keep that cycle going, right? And now it's time for a new one, and to get to do all of it again.
I know. I feel like some people, and maybe I'm one of them, some people make movies like because the festival part of it is just so fun. It's like you need that experience in your life. I've
met people who hate that. They hate it. Like their happiness is when they're on set.
Filmmaking, like it's so strange because you have to go back and forth between being an introvert and being an extrovert.
Right.
So it's like when you're writing and prepping the film, you're a total introvert. When you're on set, extrovert. When you're editing, I edited The Ranger, and then I brought in a co-editor at the end to kind of kill some of my darlings. But for most of the editing process, introvert. And then you have to go on to the, festival tour and be a total extrovert. I don't know. So it's like, I think it's fun shifting between those two polar opposites, but
I think that's also really interesting. It's not something I would have thought about, but you're totally right. Like you do kind of have to have both skill sets or both mentalities to survive it. Editing makes me depressed. I hate it. I hate it.
Really?
Oh, by the time I'm done with a project, I just want to cry. And I never want to see it again. But it's part of the process.
You get to like put your movie together. It's like you're sewing your movie together.
I know, it's like a big pile of Legos and they hurt me. I don't know. Okay, so that being said, you've gone on to direct some television, and I wanted to ask, you did an episode last year of Pandora, sci-fi series. What's the difference for you? What do you think the main difference between directing an indie horror and directing television is?
I found that the main difference is that when you're directing an episode of TV, you're a guest of the series, and it's the showrunner's vision, and the showrunner has established the world. And so I found that my role doing the TV episode was mostly like I had to get caught up to speed. Everyone else is already there. Like the DP knows what the visual style is, the costume, like everybody knows what's been established. Right. And the director has to get caught up really fast. So a lot of the job is like, okay, has this been established? No, yes. If it hasn't been established, conversation with the showrunner about like, how should we establish this? What should the vibe be? Whereas, so you're matching the world that's already established. Whereas in an indie horror movie, you're creating the world. And I think both are so much fun. They're just like different exercises. Is
there anything you can talk about that is coming up that you can tell us about, or?
Can't talk about anything, but I'm trying to use my quarantine period productively. I'll just say that.
That's good. How is quarantine for a independent producer, writer, director in New York?
It's a little bit crazy because I don't leave my apartment very much. I did a little bit to support the protests happening, but up until this past week, I pretty much stayed in my apartment since March. So that's a little maddening. I'm really looking forward to when the world goes back to normal, but it's also a total privilege that I'm very grateful for, to be able to
to focus on creative.
And take cover in my apartment. So I'm totally grateful for that.
I feel the same way.
And this whole thing is the whole industry was shut down. It's something everyone is experiencing and dealing with. So I don't know. There's hope that it'll return soon enough.
Yeah.
It's also nice to have some time to like reflect, to move a little slower, to think about things, to reflect, to read, to like get your, when you're jumping from project to project, simple nourishments like reading for pleasure, like get lost. So it was
100%. Yeah.
yeah, it's nice to have a little bit of time to recharge.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm very guilty of always being on output mode. And I forget that the reason I do this is all the stuff that I loved and I'm not getting enough input. So I really have to make time for that now. It's a challenge. And you're right. This is forcing us to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, social media, if anyone is looking for you.
I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. On Instagram, I'm at Bubblegum and Blood. And Twitter, I'm J_Wex.
Awesome. Well, Wex, one of my favorite people at FearNet. Don't tell the others, though. It's been a pleasure to watch your creative star rise, and I look forward to the next.
Oh, my God. Well, Gavin, I miss hanging out with you all the time.
Well, we're going to, you heard it here first, everyone who watches this YouTube. We're going to work together one of these days, somehow.
Very soon.
Yeah.
Very
awesome.
soon.
Well, thank you so much. Stay safe, and we'll have to do another one day.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.